Hello everybody and welcome to this session on grammar. There are 3 objectives for this session. The first one is to revise and consolidate parts of speech. Before you get to this PowerPoint, you should already have completed the task on Moodle, which is focusing on parts of speech, and you should have done that as many times as it takes for you to get 100% consistently. It's really important that you're familiar and confident with labelling parts of speech before you move on to this session. So please make sure that you're happy with parts of speech. We're going to identify the organisational hierarchy of sentences. So that means we're going to look at sentences, how they're structured, how they're made up, and how they sort of work, how we can break them down and look at the components that make up sentences. And we're going to identify and look more closely at nouns and verbs and how they behave in sentences. Most of the content of this session is actually taken from David Crystal's book, Rediscover Grammar, so just to acknowledge that, and that's a really good book for you to use to look in more detail and just to really get to grips with grammar, as well as Michael Swan's Practical English Usage, and they're both listed at the end of this session. I should say that at this point, this session, you might feel that it's quite heavy. It's likely to have a lot of terminology, concepts that are unfamiliar to you, depending on where you're at with grammar at the moment. So I don't want you to freak out. I'm not saying that you will necessarily, but just in case you do start to feel a little bit unsure about things and feel that it's too heavy and dense, then don't worry about that. It's quite normal for you to have to look at this PowerPoint a couple of times to start getting to grips with it, and to look at some grammar books to help you. Just to feel a bit more confident about it. It's just an introduction, it's an overview. I'm not expecting that you're going to be grammar experts by the end of it by any means. It's just sort of to point out some of the key aspects that you should start to at least be aware of and think about. Okay, so that's just sort of a caveat before we get started. And one more thing before we get started is that I will be asking you to pause at various intervals as we go through, for you to have a go at doing some tasks before we then resume and look at the answers. So please do that. I think it will make it more interesting and meaningful for you if you do pause and try the tasks rather than being a passive viewer. Okay. So without any further ado, let's have a look at parts of speech. So all I'd like you to do then is have a look at these 3 sentences, pause the video and label the parts of speech in the sentence. So each word, I'd like you to label it according to whether it's a noun, a verb, determiner, preposition, etc. So pause there and have a go at labeling those 3 sentences. Okay, so answers are coming up. The first sentence then: the lucky boys saw the clowns at the circus and they cheered loudly. Apologies for the naff sentences here. Okay, so we've got the lucky boys, that's determiner, adjective, noun. Saw is your verb. The clowns, determiner, noun. At the circus, we've got preposition, determiner, noun. And, that's your conjunction, your joining word, and then they is the pronoun, cheered loudly, verb and adverb. Okay, second sentence: the boy rubbed the magic lamp and suddenly a genie appeared beside him. They're the labels for those words. And Jack played in the garden while I was working. Answers for that one. Okay, you probably haven't got 100% for that, but depending on how well you did, you might feel that at this point it's wise for you just to go away and just swat up a little bit more on those parts of speech. And the important thing is not whether you got them all right or whether you made any mistakes there, but just to satisfy yourself and feel happy about why you made the mistake and that you can understand why those words are what they are. Okay, so anything that you're not sure about or not happy about, put a question on the grammar forum, or we'll talk about it in the next face-to-face session. Okay, so that's parts of speech then. We're going to move on now to look at how sentences are structured, how we can break down sentences into different levels. So that's known as the organisational hierarchy of sentences. So if we have a look at a sentence then, Jack played in the garden while I was working, we can divide the sentence into two clauses. Okay, so the two clauses in this sentence are Jack played in the garden and then while I was working. Okay, so actually while, that is your conjunction joining together the two clauses. Sentences can just be made up of one clause. So for example, we could just finish at Jack played in the garden. That's a sentence, it's grammatically correct, and that consists of just one clause, so that would be known as a simple sentence. If we have more than one clause, then it's known as a multiple sentence. Okay, so that's the first level that we can sort of break sentences down into. Clauses, we can break clauses down into phrases. So if we look at the phrases, that's what the clauses break down into. Okay, and we're going to look at how and why they're in such a way in the next slide or two. And then finally separate those out into the individual word components. That's how that looks. Okay, so sentences can be broken down into clauses, of which there may be one or more than one, and those clauses are joined together with conjunctions. The clauses can be broken down into phrases, which may consist of just one word or a group of words. And then the phrases can be broken down into individual words. Right, so let's move on now and have a look at how we can categorize these levels. Okay. So, clauses, we can categorize them according to whether they are main clauses or subordinate clauses. So that just means basically if it's a main clause, it can stand alone, it can function on its own. So we can say Jack played in the garden. That's the main clause. It can stand alone. It makes perfect sense on its own. However, while I was working, the subordinate clause is dependent. We can't just say while I was working and leave it at that. We need to know something else for it to make sense. Okay, so that's how we can classify clauses. Phrases can be classified according to whether they are a noun phrase, a verb phrase, or a prepositional phrase. We're going to look at those in a bit more detail in a second. And as we already know, words can be classified according to the part of speech. Okay, so let's just briefly focus on phrases a little bit more. We can look at phrases in terms of a sentence, which has to have a noun phrase plus a verb phrase. So, what does a noun phrase consist of? Well, it can consist of a noun on its own. It may have an adjective before it, and it may have a determinant before it, or it can just be a noun on its own. So it can also have a pronoun, or it can also be a proper noun. So that's the name of a person or a place. Okay, so a noun, a pronoun, or a proper noun, and maybe a determinant, maybe an adjective. That's what a noun phrase consists of. A verb phrase consists of a verb, can be just a verb on its own, or it can be a verb plus a noun phrase, or it can be a verb and a prepositional phrase, or a verb and an adverb. Okay, but at the minimum it's got to have a verb. A prepositional phrase consists of a preposition and a noun phrase. So let's have a look at that in practice. We're going to look at this sentence again. Jack played in the garden while I was working, and what I'd like you to do is to label that sentence, working your way up the tree, if you like. So I'd like you to label each individual word according to its class, its part of speech, which you should be fairly happy with doing. And then at the next level up, I'd like you to identify verb phrases, noun phrases, and prepositional phrases, and they can join together higher up the levels, and then tell me which is the main clause and which is the subordinate clause. And then the top level, right at the top here, that's your sentence. So you've got your sentence here, you've got your two clauses here and here, and then you've got your phrases, noun phrase, verb phrase, prepositional phrase, etc. And then the lowest level, you've got your individual parts of speech. So pause there and have a go at labelling that tree diagram. Okay, so answers are coming up, and that's what it should look like. So we can see at the bottom we've got the word classes, the parts of speech, and then a noun functions as a noun phrase, followed by a verb phrase, followed by a prepositional phrase, which is made up of a preposition plus a noun phrase, and those together with a verb phrase in front make up a verb phrase. So we can sort of break it down into various levels. Okay, then we've got a conjunction, another noun phrase, which is a pronoun in this case, and a verb phrase. And we put those together, and that makes the subordinate clause, because it's got a conjunction at the beginning of it. It's a subordinate clause. That means it can't stand alone. The other clause could stand alone if we wanted it to, and then those two together make up the tense. Okay, so let's have a look at clauses in a bit more detail. Basically, clauses are made up of elements. Okay, and there are 5 types of element, and this example sentence that we've got here contains all 5 of those elements. Okay, so the first element is the subject, and the job of the subject is to tell us what the theme or the topic of the clause is. So it tells us who or what is doing or is happening. Another element is the verb element, and that tells us about actions or sensations or states. Okay, so it's not just a doing word, it can be a being word as well, or a feeling. And then we've got the object element, and that tells us who or what is affected by the verb. Okay, so that's the thing that's being influenced by the verb. And there are 2 types of object. There's a direct and there's an indirect object. We've then got a complement, okay, and that gives us more information about another element in the sentence. It could give us more information about the subject or the object or even the verb. And then we've got the adverbial element, and that gives us a bit more information about the situation. It could tell us about when it happened, or how often it happened, or where it happened. Okay, so those are your 5 clause elements. A sentence might have all 5 in, it might have just 1 or 2 in. Okay, so let's have a look at how these clause elements can combine together into patterns. We put these 5 clause elements together and they make up to 7 basic clause types, so they can combine into 7 possible patterns. Okay, so here is the first pattern, subject and a verb. For example, Hilary yawned. Second pattern, subject, verb, object. Hilary opened the door. And then subject, verb, complement. Hilary is ready. The complement often follows the verb to be. We can have subject, verb, adverbial. Hilary lives in London. In London being the adverbial, it gives us more information about Hilary and where she lives, so it tells us where. Okay, and then we start getting a little bit more complex. We can have subject, verb and 2 objects. So Hilary gave me a pen. We've got 2 objects there. One is me and one is a pen. So we've got direct and indirect objects. A pen is the direct object and me is the indirect object. The way I find it easy to remember is that the direct object is the one that's nearest the subject. So if we physically imagine Hilary with a pen, giving it to me, the pen is the nearest thing to Hilary, the subject. So that's the direct object. I'm one step away, so me is the indirect object. Next possible pattern is subject, verb, object and complement. So Hilary got her hair wet. And finally we can have subject, verb, object and adverbial. So Hilary put the box on the table. Okay. This last one, it is possible to change the order of that. We can actually have the adverbial at the beginning of the sentence. Not in this example sentence, obviously we couldn't start with on the table, but you'll see in the next slide that it is possible to change the order of the adverbial sometimes. Okay, so let's try that out. Let's put that into practice. So I'd like you to have a go at labelling these 3 sentences according to their clause elements. So label the bits in the boxes according to whether it's a subject, a verb, object. You can have a go at saying if it's direct or indirect object, if that's applicable, complement or adverbial. So pause there and have a go at labelling those 3 sentences. Okay, answers coming up. So that's what you should have. You can see down in the 3rd sentence, the adverbial, as I said earlier, that's actually come at the beginning of the sentence there, subject, verb, object, complement. The adverbial in this sentence could go at the end. We could say, I thought her work awful, actually. But it can also go at the beginning. Actually, I thought her work awful. So adverbials can, in certain contexts and in certain sentences, swap their position. Okay. So now let's have a look a bit more closely at the verb element. We're going to look. Okay, so a verb element, some important features to know about the verb element. First of all, it's the most obligatory of all the clause elements. We can't have a clause without without a verb. We can miss other clause elements out. They're optional, but a verb is obligatory. There are some exceptions to this, but we're not going to go into that at the moment. And basically, a verb element consists of a verb on its own or a verb phrase. As we know, a verb phrase is a verb plus a noun phrase, or a verb plus a prepositional phrase, or a verb plus an adverb. Right, let's have a look at the verb then. Types of verbs. We can classify verbs into 2 groups, whether they are transitive or intransitive. Transitive means that they need an object. They can't just stand alone in a sentence. They need something after them. Intransitive verbs can stand alone, so they don't need an object. I'd like you to pause now, have a look at this group of verbs, see if you can divide them into 2 lists, transitive and intransitive verbs. So your transitive verbs: carry, desire, bring, get, keep, need, like, use, find and raise. Okay, they couldn't stand on their own. You couldn't just say I carried. We need to say I carried a bag. We can't say I need. We have to say I need chocolate. Okay, for those to make sense, they need a verb. Sorry, they need an object. Intransitive verbs can stand on their own. So appear, die, waited, happen, fall, rise and lie. So the taxi appeared, the sun rose, my granddad died. They don't need anything to come after them in order to make sense. Okay. It is possible to have verbs that are both or sort of semi-transitive, and we can look in a lot more detail at that, but at the moment suffice it to say that generally speaking verbs are either transitive or intransitive. Okay. In terms of how verb phrases are made up, we said that it can consist of a verb. Well, actually it can consist of several verbs. So that means there's got to be a main verb there, but it can be accompanied by up to 4 auxiliary verbs. So auxiliary verbs, we can also say helping verbs. Alright, so in the sentence Sarah has sore lips, then we've got one verb, that's the verb phrase, and it's the main verb, so it's on its own. In the sentence she must have been being kissed, we've got the verb phrase, and that consists of 5 verbs. So kissed is the main verb, and there's 4 auxiliary or 4 helping verbs, must have been being. Okay. So within a verb phrase, what types of verbs are there? We've already said there are transitive verbs and intransitive verbs, so that's the sort of broad categories, and within those we can analyse them in a little bit more detail. So the first kind of verb is a full verb or lexical verb, and that basically means that it carries the meaning. It sort of makes sense. It's got some meaning on its own, and they generally act as main verbs. So examples there are run, jump, go, look, want, think and find, and there are billions more. They're unlimited actually. We can invent verbs all the time. For example, to Google something. That's a new one that's just been invented recently. Okay, so they are main verbs. So another type of verb are modal auxiliary verbs, and we use these to sort of express subtleties of mood, judgment and attitudes, whether or not how likely something is. And the modal auxiliary verbs are these: will, shall, would, might, may, can, could, should and must, and these can't happen on their own in a sentence. They have to come together with a main verb. Okay, so the auxiliary verbs, they need a main verb with them. They can't stand on their own. There are 4 other sort of semi-modal verbs: need, ought to, dare and used to, and they, depending on how they're used in the sentence, sometimes act as modal auxiliaries, sometimes act as main verbs. We've got primary verbs, and there are 3 of these, and they can function as main verbs or auxiliary verbs, and these are be, have and do. Okay, so let's have a look at how they function as main verbs and how they function as auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs often help us to specify the tense, the time when something's happening, whether it's now or past or future. And they also help us to make questions and help us to make negatives. So those are the 3 primary verbs. Another way to classify verbs is to look at whether they are active or passive, and this is known as the voice, the active voice and the passive voice. It's not a tense, it's a voice. So let's have a look at these two sentences. We've got the dog saw the cat, that's the active voice, and then we've got the cat was seen by the dog. Now just pause there for a second, have a look at those two sentences, see if you can work out the rules or the guidelines for changing an active into a passive. So pause there and have a go at that. Answers. The active voice is subject, verb and object. In the passive voice, the object comes to the front of the sentence and functions as the subject. The verb remains in the same place, but it needs to take on an auxiliary verb there, was in this case, and the subject is tagged on to the end of the sentence, and it's what's known as the agent. Now it's important to know that the agent, we can actually miss that off. We don't have to have that, so we can just say the cat was chased, and we often use the passive if we don't know who did the chasing, if we don't know who the agent is, or if we don't want to say who the agent is. And famous example is mistakes were made. Okay, so it can be used for diplomatic reasons as well as the fact that you just don't know who did something. Okay, so that's the end of the focus on verbs and verb phrases. We've only scratched the surface. What I'd like you to do ready for next time is just do a bit of research. I'd like you to find out what we mean by a verb tense. What is a verb tense and some examples of that. I'd like you to find out what we mean by aspect. And I'd like you to find out what we mean by finite and non-finite verb forms. Okay, so that's a little task for you to research ready for the next session. We're going to move on now to look at noun phrases in more detail. So, important things to know about noun phrases are that they can function either as the subject or as the object or even as the complement of a clause. Okay. And they can consist of a noun on its own, or they can have other constituents such as a prepositional phrase, etc. So, constituents of the noun phrase then, we need first of all the head. That's obligatory, we can't not have it, and the head is what controls the agreement with the verb. So what we mean by that, subject-verb agreement, if the head is singular, in this example car, the verb must also be singular, is. However, if the head is plural, cars, then we need a plural verb as well, are. We can have a determiner that comes before the head, and that tells us a bit more about the kind of noun that it is, and examples are a, all, many, the, my, some. We can have a pre-modifier, so that's any other words apart from the determiner that come before the head, and they're often adjectives. And finally we can have a post-modifier, and that's anything that comes after the head, so it can be a single word or it can be a phrase. Right, so let's see if we can apply this information, and I'd like you to try and divide these noun phrases into constituents. So can you label which bit's the head, which is the determiner, any pre-modifiers and any post-modifiers. So pause there, have a go at labelling those noun phrases. Alright, answers coming up. So the first one, the head is buns. We've got two determiners, we've got a pre-modifier, and we've got in the window, that's the post-modifier. Next one, head is the car. We've got two pre-modifiers, we've got a determiner, and then parked in the garage all functions as a post-modifier. Fred, well, there's only one thing, so it has to be the head. And then the last one, books is the head, and we've got one determiner and we've got post-modifier in the shop. Another way to We can divide nouns into noun classes. So nouns basically can be divided into proper or common nouns. Proper nouns being names of people and places. Common nouns are all the rest. So your common nouns, we can divide those into count and non-count, sometimes known as countable and uncountable. And examples of countable are concrete and abstract nouns, and the same with non-countable nouns. They can be concrete and abstract. So let's have a look at some examples of concrete countable nouns. They would be things like table, chair, car, computer, and abstract countable nouns, idea, thought, suggestion, etc. And they're countable because we can have one or we can have more than one, so they can be singular or plural. We can say a table, an idea, or we can say some cars and 5 suggestions. Uncountable nouns can also be concrete or abstract, so examples of concrete non-countable nouns are sugar, milk, paper, and abstract non-countables are love, education, etc. And generally speaking, we cannot have singular and plural of these. We couldn't say a milk or 3 educations. There are certain contexts that we can use them in the plural. So for example, I'd like 3 sugars please, but that depends on the context, and generally we can classify them into those groups. Some further reading there. Definitely I'd advise you to have a look at David Crystal's Rediscover Grammar, and you'll recognise a lot of what I've got in this PowerPoint is from that. And also Michael Swan's Practical English Usage. You have to have that. If you've not got it already, you must buy it immediately. And another great one is Yule. He especially looks at the noun phrases, verb phrases, etc. So the other ones I'm not as familiar with, so if you've got those, you'll have to tell me what you think about them. There is a task to do that follows on from this session, and I'm going to put you into pairs for that, and I'm going to ask you to research one of these grammatical features and present it at the next session. So please have a look at the task associated with this session and who your partner is. So that's all for now. I hope it hasn't been too mind-boggling for you, and I'll see you soon.